Hi, this video is for an undergraduate thesis assignment. The topic of this video is narrative theory, with specific focus on the concepts of kernels and satellites. So let's talk about narratives. According to O'Sullivan, Saunders, and Fiske, narratives adhere to specific rules and strategies that keep the story elements flowing in a logical succession. So basically, they tend to be linear and therefore comprehensible. Seymour Chatman claims that a narrative has two parts, a story and a discourse. The story is what happens, while the discourse is how it happens. We won't be focusing on the discourse today. So back to the story. Within the story, there are two more subsets, the events and the existence. The events are the actions and happenings. The existence are the characters and setting. We also won't be focusing on the existence today. Within the events are the two final categories, kernels and satellites. Kernels and satellites are both types of scenes. Metz describes scenes as a couple of camera shots strung together that show action consistent in space and time. Kernels, no, I don't mean popcorn, are the parts of the narrative that move the story in one direction or another. If you were to take one out, the whole story probably wouldn't make any sense anymore. Satellites, not the ones in space, focus on character, setting, or incidental actions that don't really move the story along. If you were to remove a satellite, the story would still remain intact, although it would probably lose some aesthetic flair. If the story were a car, the kernels would be the engine and the wheels, while the satellites would be the radio and the seat warmers. So you can drive in silence, but not without horsepower. The concept of kernels and satellites originally came from a French literary theorist named Roland Barthes. Of course, his work was in French, but luckily it was translated into English by the previously mentioned Seymour Chatman. Chatman redefined his work, and in my opinion, his explanations are richer and clearer. Chatman also defended Barthes against critics who thought his terms were useless because they didn't offer any new way to read a text, and instead just seemed to state the obvious. But Chatman was like, no guys, that's not the point. The point is that they exist at all, and that their existence is crucial to studying narrative theory. As he says, just because you know how to walk doesn't mean that physiology is dumb. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Some years later, a group of people, probably professors, named Michael Porter, Deborah Larson, Alison Hearthcock, and Kelly Nellis wrote an article saying, hey, we like this idea of kernels and satellites. It can be very useful. But it's kind of hard to teach. We need kernels and satellites to be defined more specifically. So we're going to take it a step further, and thus the scene function model was born. They broke the kernels down into 6 functions: disturbance, obstacle, complication, confrontation, crisis, and resolution. And they said, with Chatman, one could ask, is this scene a kernel? But with this model, we can now move to a more useful understanding of the narrative by answering the question, how does this kernel move the story along? Next are the satellites, which were broken down into 12 functions: exposition, dramatic question, introduction of a new character, action, plan revealed, relationship affirmation, clarification, conflict continues, relief, theme, foreshadowing, and ambience. Once again, they said, the question moves from, is this scene a satellite, to, how does this satellite enhance or expand the story? They found success in their classrooms and also used the scene function model to ask a few more questions, like, could this story be told without this scene? Or maybe, whose story is being told? What about, what did we learn from this scene? And, why is this scene here? And so forth. Of course, while all of this is great and makes identifying kernels and satellites a lot easier, not everyone can actually agree on the function of each scene. Some of the problems these authors had were initial perception versus final perception. In other words, your opinion on a scene might change once you finish the narrative. Fans versus novice viewers. You may find a scene more important if you don't know much of the backstory. This is especially confusing when it comes to character relationships. Multiple stories per scene, which can make it confusing to identify the primary focus. And finally, narrative layers. This is when the show uses layers to address the needs of a variety of viewers. Let's review. We discussed kernels and satellites. Kernels are important and cannot be removed. Satellites are less important and can be removed, but it's less fun that way. We also discussed the scene function model, which is a more specific way to identify kernels and satellites. And that's all for now. Thanks for watching.